Well, we're looking at Daniel. Daniel at this point is at the very end of his life. He's lived 80 years or 80 plus years. We don't know how old Daniel is at this point, but he's very old. He's on his third king. Remember last week we were talking about Nebuchadnezzar? We'll go back to Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar before it's all over. But we went from Nebuchadnezzar, and then his son came in after Nebuchadnezzar died and took over, Belshazzar. And then by the beginning of Belshazzar's reign, things didn't go well for the Assyrians, and the Persians, which today is known as Iran, came in and took over the Babylonians, or the Babylonians, Assyria. And they ruled for many years, but starting about 540 BC is when they came in. So a whole political change came in, and it's going to turn out really good for the exiled Jews. But right now, not so much. So Daniel is serving under a king named Darius. Some people think he's Cyrus the Great. There's a little wondering about that. Regardless, Darius comes through, being remembered throughout history as one of the great organizers. A genius administrator is what they have attributed to Darius. And you can kind of see what Darius did. Darius, he had 3 administrators in his kingdom. And under those 3 administrators, getting a lot of feedback this morning. Under these 3 administrators were 120 what they called satraps. Now, a satrap is known as the kingdom protector. And the satrap's duty was, first of all, to put down any rebellions. You got to do that. The next thing a satrap had to do is he had to levy taxes. But the third thing a satrap had to do was he had to make sure that all the financial income and expenses were all being balanced. Everything's going to be okay. We could use some satraps today, couldn't we, in our own kingdom here. But this is kind of how they manage these things. One of those 3 administrators was Daniel. But among the 3 administrators, Daniel stood way out. He really impressed the king about what he was doing and how well and how competent he was at administering that. So let's look here at our first verse, and this is what we're going to see. And this is Daniel chapter 6, verses 1 through 3, and it says, "It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his exceptional qualities." And then this is where the problem starts. The king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Now, here's a point where God sees something that he wants to bless, that he wants to increase, but at this point, it's just God that wants to do this, and God is working in the system to see this happen. But the other 2 administrators and all the other satraps, they start thinking, wait a minute, I don't like this guy reaching out ahead or getting out ahead. What happens when one person starts to do something that other people feel is going to infringe on their authority, or might infringe on their profit, or might have some detrimental effect to them, that they're going to get something that you are trying to... What happens when life just deals differently, different amounts to different people? The people who end up with the less get very upset with those who get more, and they try to find ways, right? This happens in our lives today. We all have to deal with, when God blesses us, people come up against us. It's just how it always is. And as Christians, when God blesses us, it's disappointing to us when people come up against us. So I'm going to talk about 3 points that we can learn from Daniel here. 3 points about how to deal with those who oppress us when those are the ones who have authority over us. How does a Christian respond to that? I'm not just talking about a governmental entity coming in and making a law that puts you in a corner. I'm also talking, and this is where it really takes place, I'm talking about families, relationships with friendships, a dating relationship, a marriage relationship. When somebody says, you know, I wish you would be behaving a little bit differently. I wish you would do this the way I want it done. I wish you wouldn't go to church every Sunday. I wish we could do this. I wish we could do that. They come against you. They put a lot of pressure, and we have to sit back. We have to take a step back and try to evaluate. Wait a minute. This is what God would have me do, but these are what these people who have a lot of influence in my life would want me to do. Now, how do I deal with this? How do I come out of this? We're going to see three different ways that God can help us stand strong. And number one is exactly what we're talking about. When God raises you up, expect people to tear you down. When God raises you up, expect people to tear you down. When I was in New England, lots of people like to go crabbing. And so they would catch these crabs, put them in a bucket. The most interesting thing would happen. The one crab would see the top edge of the bucket, and he would get all excited, and he would think, all I got to do is climb out this bucket, and I'll be free. And he would stand and climb on top of other ones, and every once in a while, he would get a tentacle just at the very tip of that bucket, and he would begin to pull himself up. And the other crabs, this is crazy, the other crabs would see that one crab pulling himself out. And what they would do, they would go over to that crab. They'd rush over there, grab the bottom of that crab and pull him down. And instead of reaching up, they would walk away. It was kind of like they were saying, look, if we're all going to boil, you are too. You're not going to be getting ahead of any of us. And I would watch this time and time again. It just confounded me. Why do the other crabs care if one is about to get out? I don't know, but something in their nature made them care seriously about it, enough to pull them down. A figure in history that I really like is the founder of the Salvation Army, a guy named William Booth. And William Booth had a great effect when he started helping the poor, the compassionate in England, in London specifically. And it was a terrible time. Now, wouldn't you think somebody coming up with some ideas to gather people together to help the most destitute? He wasn't taxing anybody. He wasn't causing anybody discomfort. He was blessing. He was helping people. How could anybody not like what William Booth was doing to help the children and the very poor of London? Well, you wouldn't believe. Tons of people didn't like what William Booth was doing, mostly politicians. I have no clue why. Even some religious kind of politicians. What one of them did was they added up the letters in William Booth's name. So they would ascribe A as a 1, a B as a 2, and they did that for his name. And I didn't do it, but this was what I read, was that they found that if you add up his entire name, the total comes to 666. Oh, he must be the Antichrist. He's the Antichrist. William Booth, that's right, that's what he is. And they would come against him. Now his son, his name was Bromwell. And Bromwell went on to become a great leader also in the Salvation Army, as we know it today. But there was a time when William Booth had to help his son understand and deal with opposition. Because the truth is, if God is going to bless you, if God is going to use you, if God is going to do something good, you can expect the opposition to start coming in. In fact, kind of the opposite also works too. If you don't have opposition, if you don't have people coming against you, you might want to ask yourself, am I doing something? Am I doing what God's called me to do? It works that way too. But this is what this is what William Booth told his son Bromwell. He says, in 50 years, it's going to matter very little how people dealt with us. But it's going to be a huge deal by how we dealt with the work of God. And isn't that true? 50 years from now, who cares what people called you or said about you or did anything? But 50 years from now, it matters a great deal about how we deal with the work of God and what God wants to do. That's a really great perspective to help us out with that. The second thing that we want to look at, the rule that we have here to help you stand strong is this. Oh, I should probably read the verse, shouldn't I? Okay, Daniel chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. At this, the administrators and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. And this is a sentence that I really want to pay attention to. It's an amazing sentence that this could really be said about anybody, because in our country, nobody thinks you can really say this about somebody. But look at here. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Can you imagine in our political space? You know how politicians now, they go find dirt on people and slam them with that, and they put it up so we can all be, impressed by what a horrible person somebody is? That's what they tried to do to Daniel, and they actually found nothing. Not because he was a child and he hadn't done anything, because he was an old man and had lived right his entire life before God. His enemies could find nothing. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis of charges against this man Daniel." They had to deal with that fact, unless it has something to do with the law of his God. So this is what they did. They knew that Daniel was going to pay attention to God no matter what. They knew that Daniel's ultimate loyalty was always to God and not to any king, not to anybody else. Most of our laws are right according to how we would have them be, because laws are about helping a community strive and do well and thrive. Well, that's what God's word is for us. But every once in a while in history, there comes a time when a government says, "I don't like competing with your worship of God. I want you to worship me and give me first priority and disregard your God." Every once in a while that happens. It rolls around in every culture. Someday we'll have it. Right now other people have it. Regardless, Daniel had it. And they came to Daniel and they studied him and said, "We're going to put you against the king." And so this is what they did. They went to the king and they said, "Mr. King, you are so great and so wonderful. You know what all your administrators and all your satraps," of course, never mind Daniel being included, right? You know what they're all saying should do? They're so impressed with you, so grateful for you. They're saying that you should give just 1 month where nobody prays to any other god except you. And Darius thought for a bit. That would be nice. I don't remember people not praying for other gods and praying to me. I am their king. What would that hurt? What's wrong with that? And so that's kind of what they managed to drum up here. And they got all excited because they made the king sign a very interesting thing, a law that not even the king could retract. Kind of like the Magna Carta or even our own Constitution. Isn't that interesting? And that's what their expectation. This was what would happen. And so they said, "Okay, now we're just going to let it go and let time play out, and we'll just pick up Daniel on the way to the lion's den." And so this is what we find here with Daniel. Daniel's given this law, and he knew what it was about, but Daniel's not going to change anything about his life. He's lived this way 80 years. He's had many death threats before, and he says, "This is the way I've been. This is the way I'm going to be. God gets first priority in my life. I've already made these decisions. It's already settled. This is how it's going to be." You and I could learn a lot by pre-deciding how it's going to be. Regardless of what everybody else does, regardless of what the cost is to us, we are going to stand strong with God, and we're going to see this thing through, and we're going to do what God values. We're going to do what is important to God. And no matter, this is how it's just going to be. And this is where Daniel comes in, and he does what he had always done. And this is what we learn about Daniel. And here's our second point about how to stand strong. Kneeling to pray is what gives you the strength to stand. Kneeling to pray, and this is what the Bible says. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. Now remember, Jerusalem had been destroyed, and Daniel, as a very small boy, was taken from Jerusalem when so many others were murdered, brought to be a Babylonian and to serve in the courts because he was very gifted. And so there he is, but he kept that hope that someday they would go back to what was Jerusalem and rebuild it. So Daniel kept that hope, kept the windows open, and he would pray in the direction of Jerusalem. That's not something that the Bible tells us to do, but you could see the passion, you could see the priority, you could see Daniel's vision to see through those who are arrayed against him, beyond that to see what God was doing. And that's where Daniel's focus was, and that's where your focus and my focus have to be. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. I love that phrase. There's several phrases in this that just says this is the way it's always been for Daniel. This is just what he does. This is his custom. This is his practice. This is his habit. He got down on his knees. You know, there's no way in the Bible that says this is how you have to pray. But I will tell you from my personal experience, and I don't know if you would share this, but when I pray, I get one feeling when I stand or I walk around. And that's probably mostly how I pray. But every once in a while, God puts something on my heart. And I can't do anything else other than to kneel before God, whether it be a chair or a bed, whatever it might be. But you just get right down. Our posture has so much to do with our communicating, doesn't it, with people, but also with God. And I would really encourage you, when God puts it on your heart, something heavy or just a matter of habit, kneel to pray before God. Let God know your posture, that you do not stand as a equal to God or a partner with God, but you really stand under God, that you recognize his sovereignty and his place, that unless God moves, nothing is going to move. Just kneeling before God, what a difference that makes, just as he had done before. I like Peter chapter 5, verse 7. Cast your cares on him. Why? Because he cares for you. That's what you do. When we come to pray, we cast our cares on God. Isn't it something that he cares for you? Have you ever imagined this, that the creator of the entire universe, not just our galaxy, not just our planets, not just of nature, not just the oceans, but the creator of the entire universe, both past, future, present, future, the one who is way out ahead in a whole different dimension, creating eternity, the one who speaks, the one who everything listens and responds to, the one who is so faithful to someone whose name you've never heard, but when you meet them, you'll say, I recognize who your friend is. I recognize the God who is inside of you. That God, the God that you hear other people talk about, these miraculous things that he has done, the healings that he has done, and the answers that he has brought, and most importantly, how God has been able to change people's hearts. Completely, God has done things to change somebody's heart who nothing, no plan, no program could ever change. But God changed. This is the God who says, I care about you. Here I am. Can you imagine when you stand before God, when you kneel before God, God is coming right up next to you and he's putting his arm around you, and what he is saying to you is, here I am. Here I am. This is not a governmental agency where you fill out a little suggestion form and know that nobody's ever going to care about that. No, this is a God who listens and comes and listens. And when somebody says, we can pray about that. Sometimes when we hear that, we downgrade it, don't we? Oh, has it really come to that? We have to pray about this? Oh, that's not good. I didn't know it got so bad. Is it really that serious of a problem? It's come to this? Prayer? Right? We joke around like that sometimes. It's not about, is it really to the point where we have to pray about it? No, this is what it is. We can pray about it. That's what we can do. We can pray. It's the first thing we can do. And this is what God does. He listens to your prayers. He listens to our prayers. And he answers our prayers. He answers our prayers in amazing and miraculous ways. Most of the time, he does not do exactly what we're asking him to do. Looking back, we see he did much better. He did much better. He knew exactly what had to happen. Have you ever prayed for somebody that you were really upset with and you wanted them to change and do this and do that? But instead of them changing what God did while you were blaming him for not answering your prayer, what he did instead was he began to change your heart. You ever notice that? And all of a sudden you start to see things a little differently, and God brings in an idea from somewhere. So well, where did that come from? Because boy, that really touches me. That's really meaningful to me. And all of a sudden you begin to see your heart change, but the other person hasn't changed an iota, but you've seen your own self change. And then you start living out the change that God has started in your heart. And then you begin to behave and talk and act in different ways. You're more humble, you're more gentle, you're more loving. And amazingly, the other person changes. You're like, oh, look at that, they changed. No, they didn't change, you changed. And how you changed, they responded positively to that. It's what God does. Let me tell you the bad part of this. Every once in a while when we see somebody else change, we sit back and say, oh, that wasn't so hard. I got them to change. No, you didn't. You did not get them to change. You didn't get yourself to change. You were blind to that. God got you to change. And as a result, they changed. We should never take our attention off of what God has done. Never take responsibility or credit for what God has done. Instead, what we do is give all the credit to God, and we thank God for the change that he has made in my heart, in our heart, in what he's doing, and how he's enabling us to live in a way that's causing other people to be a little bit happier, to live in more harmony. And then we find that's how God does that over and over. You know, everybody loves Abraham Lincoln, and one of Abraham Lincoln's great phrases that he would say, he says, many times I've been driven to my knees with the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go. Many times I've been driven to my knees in prayer with the overwhelming conviction I had nowhere else to go. Boy, that is true. When we have nowhere else to go, it shouldn't even be weighed like that, right? But go to God. Go to God. I've met people and they've said, oh, this is so hard. This is so heavy. I can't pray. No, it's not that you can't pray. Pray for you to pray. Pray that God would do something in your heart to change your heart, that you would be able to pray. That is your strength. That is your hope. It's the praying that's going to make the difference. It's the praying that's not going to bring God to you. God's already there. It's the praying that's going to open you up, open your eyes, open your heart. It draws you into God's presence so you can see what God is really doing right here and right now. God does a lot for us, but unless in prayer we are able to open our eyes and see what he's doing, it's going to be oblivious to us. And so God comes in and he draws us to himself. And when we open our eyes, we see that's the result of prayer. Pray. People say, well, what's the best way to pray? Let me tell you, my best way of prayer, my favorite way of praying is when I'm at home all alone and I'm kneeling on my bed and I'm crying out to God, crying with tears, crying out to God, just out of a desperation, out of a hopelessness to it. That is the very best way to pray. Praying and crying, crying and praying. They just kind of go synonymously like that. You just put it all in God's court, all in God's court. And it's amazing how God begins to flood your soul with his grace, with his presence, and with his peace when you just keep putting it all there for God. And here, this takes us to our last point here. When you do what's right, you can always trust God with the results. Isn't that amazing? When you do what's right, you can always trust God with the results. Daniel is 80 some years old. This is the way he's lived. He's done what's right before God. You and I sometimes, when we know what's right, we look out into the future and we try to weigh the consequences. And we say, well, I think this is what's going to happen. And so, I think this is going to happen if I do that. Really? You have a magic 8 ball? You have a crystal ball? How do you know what's going on? You don't have a clue because you are making assumptions that people are going to behave in a certain way. When has anybody behaved according to your expectations, right? We do not know what happens, but we evaluate ourselves based on what we think is going to happen. Well, this is what happened to Daniel. Daniel said, if the penalty for praying is to be thrown into the lion's den, then so be it. I will be thrown into the lion's den. Wouldn't you think Daniel would say, well, you know what? I've been praying for 80 years. I'm probably going to be okay if I took a vacation. It's the law of the land. We all have to please everybody. Wouldn't you think that? Or what about this? Daniel said, oh, yeah, I won't pray to my God. But then quietly, without anybody knowing, he's praying to his God. And that way he's satisfying both sides. The king gets prayed to. He thinks he's getting prayed to, and what's wrong with that? That's as good as praying to him, right? And at the same time, God's not upset. I still do whatever I want to do. Well, we found a win-win situation. It's all working out for good here. But Daniel didn't do that at all, because we know those two don't work. Daniel said, no matter what happens, I'm going to keep doing what I'm going to do. And this is how I'm going to live. I'm going to make sure I live my life right here, so that my life with God is not going to be interrupted or changed. Man alive, put it in God's hands. Do what's right. Do what's right and trust God with the results. That's the way to do it. That's how it is. Daniel, when he was thrown into the lion's den, what do you think he thought was going to happen? He thought he was going to be eaten by lions. That's what he thought was going to happen. If you would have asked him, if you would have bet Daniel money, that's where he would have put his money. And there wouldn't have been a bet because nobody would have doubted that. These lions, they're not cuddly little lions. No, these are famished monster bears. With Saddam Hussein used to keep lions to throw people into. So even in our own age, this is what goes on. These lions, like later on, when you get thrown into the den, you don't even touch the ground. The lions jump up and get you. And that's the end of that. That's what Daniel expected to happen to him, and off he went. But interestingly, God decided that there's going to be a different fate. Let me tell you how often God decides that there's going to be a different fate. Just about everybody in this room could talk about times in their lives when one thing was destined to happen. It was written. That's the way the doctor explained it. That's the way the boss has always acted. This is the way it's going to be. But God decided there would be a different fate. That is a common, regular story among those who do what is right before God. God changes the things. In this situation, the mouths of the lions did not open. The lions saw Daniel drop in, and we don't know what happened. We don't know how it happened or why it happened. All we know, this is what happens many times. Daniel survived the night, and the king came running in and rescued Daniel the next day, and the story has been told for generations to generations to generations. For what? To remind us when you do what's right, you can trust God with the results every time. Does that mean that the bad things don't happen when we do what's right before? Of course they happen. But let me tell you what, when they are happening, and I'm speaking of those bad things, God is still with us. He's still going through that, and he's still faithful, and he's still good as we go through that. Many Christians have been fed to the lions, and the lions loved eating them as much as they loved eating the non-Christians. That has happened. That's just the way it is. Not suggesting otherwise. But what I am saying, when you do what's right, God is always faithful to you. Always faithful to you when you do what's right. I love Romans 8:28 as much as anybody does. Well, a lot of us, we know it, right? And that's the verse where we talk about, whatever happens, God's going to make the good from it. God's going to see to it. According to his will, according to his purpose, we live according to that. God is always good. When you go into your problems, when you go into your challenges, what do? You step back and you apply a Romans 8:28 perspective to it. And you say, you know what? This is how I'm going to live. This is how I'm going to be. All things work together for good. All things. Really? All things? Verify that in your heart. All things? Yes, all things. What about all these bad things? Yes, all things work together for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. All things work together for good. And so we say, okay, all things work together for good. And when those come against us, when the opposition attacks us, when people try to put us down, we remember even that God is using that for his good, and we can trust him in that. You know, a Romans 8:28 perspective on the things that happen in life is a very healthy, a very Christian, a very close way of following Jesus, to understand this is how things happen, this is how things come around. God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. Nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. I went through a period of my life where I really had it rough, and a lot of people were coming against me. And I'm ashamed to say this on one side, but I'm not ashamed to say on the other, because I learned a great lesson. And it was this lesson here. When people were doing things against me, what I believed was that they had disrupted God's plan for my life. And I would say, look, this is what God wanted, but it is possible for people to interfere in such a way to disrupt what God's trying to do in your life. And that's where I had resolved to be. That's just what I'm a victim of people sabotaging God's work and God's plan in my life. This is what God wanted to happen. This is what I expected to happen. But people came in and messed the whole thing up, and now I'm a victim of that. I felt that way. I don't know how long I felt that way, but it was a long time for me. It was maybe a year or two in the midst of all that. Terribly discouraged, very depressed about that. But you know what I learned? No human being can disrupt God's destiny in your life. No human being. And you know a phrase that just came into my mind that I've learned? It's this: whatever God decides to do, I agree to do it. Whatever God decides to do, I'm okay with it. I'm going to go along with it. Why? Because God's plan and God's purpose for your life is perfectly executed in your life. Those people that emerge, to you, they look like they are going to bring an end to it. No. They are not going to bring an end to it. They are being used by God to teach you something about God's goodness and God's faithfulness. Maybe sometimes God says, I don't really think you're going to learn much from this perspective. Let's move you in a whole lot deeper darkness. And then from there, let's see what you learn about my goodness and my grace to you. All along, as we're being dragged in down to a deeper pit, we're saying, oh, God's forgotten about us. God's nowhere near. God doesn't listen. And God's not saying, oh, no, I'm standing right with you. I'm just going to show you how far you can go, and I still bring you back. That's what God's saying. All the way through. Many times in my own life, I'll find something throughout this week, and it will just disrupt my life, and it just didn't go right, and I'll get so frustrated about it. But at some point, I remind myself, wait a minute, I've seen this happen before. This isn't being used to tear me down and to ruin me and destroy me. No, God's got something else planned for this. There's a reason this is happening. Thank you, Jesus, for letting this happen. I don't know why I'm thanking you, and I might not ever know why I'm thanking you, but I do know I will thank you if I ever see the big picture and have all the information. My lands, time and time again, you just sit that peace that settles in your heart that says, yep, this is the way it's going to be. Yep, you're going to be okay. This is all part of it. These are all necessary things that have to happen. Isn't it crazy? At one point in your life, you look back and you think, oh man, at one point I thought this was be the end of me. But now you look at it and you say, oh, I see how that was necessary. I see how that was vital. I wouldn't be where I am today if that had not happened. Isn't that amazing how God does that? I've got two verses I want to share with you guys just to close with, very short verses. 1 Samuel chapter 17, 47, verse 47. Little David is up against the great Goliath. And you know what he tells us? And this is what he tells you. In the things that you're suffering, the things you're struggling with, this is what God says. The battle belongs to the Lord. The battle belongs to the Lord. It's not your battle. God's taken care of it very, very well. The battle belongs to the Lord. If it's the Lord's battle, let him fight it. You step off to the side and say, God, I will be faithful to you. I will do what is right. I'm going to stay very close to you. But you fight this battle. The battle belongs to the Lord. Can you remind yourself of that? It's not your battle. It's God's battle. Let God fight the battle. That's God's place in your life, is to be the battle. You know what? If I had a chauffeur, you know what I would do? I would let the chauffeur drive my car, and I would sit in the back. That's what I would do. If I've got a warrior who's going to fight my battles for me, I'm not going to tell him to go sit by the pool. No, I'm going to say, hey, there's a war going on. Go fight my battle for me. If God is sitting here saying, I fight the battles in your life, why are you saying, oh God, you go in where it's nice and cool and safe, and I'll go out there and I'm going to go battle and I'm going to go take these people down? Why do we do that? Let God fight the battle, and we stay right with it. God is more than confident with that. And the second verse, it's very important, I'll close with this. It's Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. Very short phrase. The just shall live by faith. The just shall live by faith. What does that mean? When your life is right before God, that's what justice is. How do we live? By faith. What does that mean? Is faith in this sense the things I believe, a list? No, it's not that at all. We live in faith. And what is faith? It's a living, daring confidence in God's grace. It is something so sure that you could stake your life on it 1,000 times. Faith is believing what nobody else can see. Well, the just shall live by faith, knowing that God will see these things through. Why? What happens? Because whenever you do what's right, there's going to be a lot of opposition. Can we handle it? Absolutely not. Can God handle it? Absolutely yes. Every single time. That's why the just shall live by faith. God will take care of these. I will do what is right for me to do. I will do what God calls me to do, and God will see to everything else. The just shall live by faith. That's how the just live. It's never been different. It's never been different. When the Jews were in the Holocaust, or when the Cambodians were fighting against the Khmer, every genocide, every time of oppression there's always been. The just shall live. You live, but then you have faith in God that God's going to see you through all the way. And that's what God does. We live by faith. We let God fight the battles. Amen? Let's pray.